Hello and welcome to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
Hi, this is Sam Wang. I'm professor of neuroscience and molecular biology at Princeton University, and I am co-founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
So since the summer's coming to an end, we thought it might be a good time to look back a little bit about what's happened in this campaign and discuss a few of the key moments in what's been certainly one of the craziest political campaigns that we've had in recent decades. There have been many incidents, from Donald Trump getting into it with his fellow Republican opponents during the debates about how big his hands are, to some of the incredible divisions and tensions that unfolded at the grassroots level on the campaign trail in both parties. From very fierce debates about what the Democratic Party should be between Sanders and Clinton supporters to actual fistfights that unfolded during Trump's campaign rallies. And the campaign itself has taken place during many big incidents that rock the nation and the world, from the brutal shootings in Orlando to the tragic attack in Nice. And while both Sam and I have devoted a lot of time during this podcast to looking at why we can't really talk much about game-changing moments where something happens that transforms the dynamics of a presidential contest, this is what Sam has done such a great job showing with his polling data, we thought maybe there was some space to talk about important events that tell us something about the campaign, the character, the dynamics of the parties, the voters, or the candidates who are in this race. So for this podcast, we decided we'd each pick three relevant moments and kind of put it together a top three list and spend some time discussing why they might be worth looking back on. So Sam, I thought maybe you'd want to kick it off with your third place winner.
Sure, absolutely. So first off, I have to do the obligatory complaint about whether these moments really matter. And so I'm just going to gas on about that for just a moment. Just to step back a little bit, I think there's a big picture here that is easy to miss, which is that that we are all watching the race day by day, interested in these specific details as you laid out. However, I think there's a picture that is the backdrop behind which all this is happening, namely that that this is a really unusual year, and people always say that this is a different year from past years, but this is a pretty freaky year. And just to give you an example of it, political scientists and economists like to think about presidential elections as being predictable from the last 20, 30, 40 years of election. And there are something like half a dozen econometric models that take into account things like the economy, the president's approval rating, unemployment, and so on, to figure out what ought to happen given economic conditions. If this year were in some sense like the last 40 years, what would happen? And it turns out, I was just reading this piece over at Vox, Vox.com, showing that describing 6 different models that all pointed towards basically a Republican Party victory in the presidential race this year, and they all pointed towards the Republican candidate getting about 51.6% of the popular vote as a median. So that's one piece of the backdrop. The other piece of the backdrop is the specific candidates, Trump and Clinton, where Clinton basically reflects what I'd call a normal nominating process, and Trump reflects a broken nominating process, or a broken party, where they didn't do what you might expect them to do, which is to pick somebody who would appeal to the most possible people in a general election. So I think that there's basically a collision: what ought to happen when both parties are working normally, and what actually is happening with one party not working normally. Now that's a big preamble. I'm sorry to gas on about it, but now I'm going to give my number 3, which is a tell that this year was odd. And it wasn't just the entry of Donald Trump into the presidential race, about 13 long months ago, but rather the fact that at the first debate, he said a lot of things that were pretty inflammatory. I think it was in the first debate that he insulted Megyn Kelly. What he did not do after that first debate is drop in the polls. So unlike Rick Santorum or Michelle Bachmann or Newt Gingrich back 4 years ago, or Herman Cain, Trump went up in the polls and he stayed up. And that was interesting, right? Just to look back and realize that this is somebody who you might think of as being too weird or too radical for to survive the primary process, and instead, what, 40% of Republican voters liked him, and they kept on liking him, and there was something about him, right? The things he was talking about and the way he said them just really appealed to them, and so that really, I felt, said a lot about the ensuing 12 months, and at some level, that particular moment has been repeated over and over and over again for the last year.
Yeah, and what's amazing to think back is how the other Republican opponents, I don't think, fully got it when that happened, nor did most pundits or experts understand what had just happened, and really neither were they cognizant that there wasn't the kind of fallout that you might expect from the performance he did. I think that that is an important key into something was working differently.
Well, I finally noticed it around the end of December when I realized that he was in as strong a position as George W. Bush in 2000 or Al Gore in 2000, and I wrote about it back then. But it is true that it was hard to notice because he was such an unusual case that I think people who run in either media or academic circles just didn't quite understand how somebody like him could be so appealing.
Yeah, it's hard to, I don't know if anyone else could have done that. You know, that's another question to think about. If any of the other candidates had acted the way he did, if there was room in the electorate for that, or if that's really particular to Donald Trump, who came already to this campaign with a huge audience from his reality TV show and his persona during the 1980s as a real estate mogul. And I think that's one thing that historians certainly will try to figure out years from now in terms of why this all happened. And certainly Republicans are going to be thinking about it if this goes the way the polls are showing.
So you're number 3.
My number 3 is, it's not a game-changing moment, so I agree with you, but the Wisconsin Democratic primary, which took place in early April, where Bernie Sanders won. And there are many reasons why he could win in Wisconsin, and the progressive traditions of that state made sense, but it was a big win for him. And I think it showed the Hillary Clinton campaign that this was not a primary threat that was going to quickly disappear. It really started to push her to recalibrate some of her campaign and to talk more going into the New York primary, I believe, about the issues that he had raised, especially the economic inequality issues and the impact of global economic changes, which are not necessarily essential early on in her campaign, but become increasingly so. And I think once that primary took place, it was pretty evident that, at least for me, and I think for other observers, that Sanders was going to be a real threat going into the convention. And so it's important not just that there's some kind of horse race, but I do think Hillary Clinton's campaign gradually changed, and I actually think she became more aggressive and focused as a candidate. She's always best when there's a threat to her, and so I think in many ways, for me, that was an important moment on the Democratic side, even though the outcome was what we expected when this all started.
Yeah, I like that one because of the non-horse raciness of it. I mean, that point that you just described illustrates to me anyway the Democrats deciding who they are this year, right? Yeah. So if who they are is partly getting back to the roots of a tradition that goes back to, I don't know, Gene McCarthy or whatever other idealistic Democrats one could think of, getting back to those roots and incorporating those roots into their message is I think a pretty important part of what happens after the election. And so, despite the fact that the reason people are tuning in is because of horse race, there are impacts that are going to happen after the election. And so I do like that one because it leads to questions about what will happen after the election and when it's time to actually attempt to pass legislation and to set policies.
And it's not simply idealism. I mean, for me, it's less Eugene McCarthy than Franklin Roosevelt. And one of the messages of the primaries, and I don't know what a Hillary Clinton administration would do if she would remember the lessons, but I think they were pretty powerful. It's about these going back to these core economic issues about the security of the middle class, which really defined the party from the 1930s to the 1960s. But many Democrats moved away from this, especially as unions became less powerful politically after the 1970s. And part of what I think Sanders was able to do, and he certainly showed there's room for this in the electorate, and in some ways the Republican primaries did this as well, is returning to those themes. And this is an ongoing tension with the Democrats. Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter had this fight during the 1980 Democratic primaries. But I think the presence and success of Sanders might have jolted the Democratic nominee to taking this seriously. And it could be big in terms of how she thinks of her agenda if she wins and when she's president. Anyway, so what's your number 2 on?
Well, before my number 2, just a quick aside. Question for you. Did Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 know that he was going to be a big liberal lion and pursue a giant agenda?
He did. I mean, he runs, if you look at his campaign, people always like to look back and you see it's very eclectic. So in 1932, he's still running on, part of his campaign is to balance the budget. But he also came out of a very progressive moment in New York state politics, and he had already been pretty committed to using the federal government to deal with some of the economic instability that had emerged. And, you know, in his acceptance speech during the Democratic convention, he had already talked about a New Deal. So this was on his mind, even though it wasn't clear cut, and he brought in more conservative elements as well. But I think he knew where this was going to go, and I think that was the direction he was pointing to.
Well, it sounds like platforms matter then.
They could.
Yeah. So let me use that to turn to my next one, which is I view a lot of the campaign as heading towards this end point, this set point, where we don't necessarily know exactly where it's headed, but there are these moments when it that jostle the race towards its final resting place, where Election Day settles things, or at least determines the outcome. And so for me, a big moment was the Democratic National Convention. The Republican Convention, as we talked about in a previous podcast, I think in my opinion, was a pretty rough event for the Republicans, but I'm not convinced that it told us anything new. I think that the big play at the Democratic Convention was basically, to my ears, speeches by Michelle Obama and by Barack Obama. And these are speeches, I mean, there are a lot of events that happened at the Democratic Convention, but really there's a lot going on there in terms of focusing who the Democrats are, focusing their claims to heartland values like patriotism and love of country and sanity. And I think that there was a big move there where there was just this realization, I think, to a lot of people watching that, at least now I'm getting a little bit pundity here, but I think in retrospect it can account for what happened in the polls afterwards, that basically there's this realization that this is who the Democrats are this year, whether it be absorbing Bernie Sanders' priorities, whether it be talking about the nation the way that Barack Obama talked about. I think that there was a lot of important stuff that happened at the Democratic Convention that had echoes that are pretty apparent in the polling data, where any jump that happened after the polls for Hillary Clinton and also for down-ticket Democrats seems to have now persisted for close to a month. And I think that that's very telling. And looking back, it's pretty clear that the moment that happened was during the Democratic Convention.
How important do you think President Obama and Michelle Obama's presence, again, not game-changing, but the fact they were front and center during that convention, combined with where Obama's approval ratings are, for me, that was very significant in terms of how Hillary Clinton is going to shape this campaign and how she's going to link herself to him.
Part of that gets back to these structural factors that determine where a race is at. So currently, Obama's approval rating is pretty high. He's at a net approval of plus 7%, which means that 7% more Americans who are surveyed approve of his performance than disapprove. And so he's at pretty high approval ratings. He's at least at the level of Ronald Reagan back in 1988, and on a par with, maybe not quite as high as Bill Clinton at the end of Clinton's presidency. So part of that is just showing that the Democrats are united, showing that that they're running on their record. And so in some sense, based on these models, this is Hillary Clinton running for a third term of Obama. And that's a kind of unity that was really not at all apparent at the Republican convention, since they didn't have any presidents or former nominees showing up at that event. So I think the contrast was pretty strong there.
And he became more interventionist in recent after the convention, I believe. I can't remember if it was during or after in terms of just directly attacking Donald Trump. So he's actually become part of the campaign beyond the link between Clinton and him. He is now campaigning for her, and he's, I think, delivered some of the hardest hitting attacks on Donald Trump since they're coming from the president himself.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. So I think a lot of that is just party consolidation and revealing to voters who they are. And there's positions that they have that are, I think, it's an interesting thought, like to what extent voters are moved by this. But they certainly revealed party platform. They revealed what their priorities are. They showcased all the major officials, big celebrities, and then at the end of it, Hillary Clinton's speech, in which she described what was important to her. So I think it was consolidation, and I think it's sort of like when you're baking a cake, the cake starts to set,
Yeah.
and the real important moment was putting the ingredients into the cake, and I would characterize that convention as sort of setting the cake a bit.
I don't know how to bake a cake, but I'm going to trust you on that.
You don't add ingredients halfway through.
So my number two will be in June, mid-June, past 2016. I think Paul Ryan was on Meet the Press, and they were asking if he was going to support Donald Trump, and he said, I feel like I have certain responsibilities, not just as Congressman Paul Ryan from the 1st District of Wisconsin, but as Speaker of the House. And imagine the Speaker of the House not supporting the duly elected nominee of our party, therefore creating a chasm in our party to split us in half, which basically helps deny us the White House and strong majorities in Congress. And I think this was important. That was back in June. There was still discussion of this anti-Trump effort within the Republican Party. There was still consideration, I know, in Republican circles of some dramatic effort at the convention to somehow overturn what happened in the primaries. But more importantly, it was just the overall attitude that the Republican leaders were going to have going into the convention. And I really think my instinct was in the end the Republicans would fall in line generally. And I think at that key moment in the summer they did. There were obviously exceptions like Mitt Romney, but it was important for Paul Ryan as the leader of the House GOP, while not enthusiastically supporting him, not to be openly critical of him. And that I think once that happened, certainly the effort to really deny Donald Trump or even attempt to deny him the nomination was over. I do think going into the summer it built some strength behind his candidacy. And even though more Republicans have now, since the convention, come out against him, there's still many who have remained silent and have passively endorsed this nominee. And I think that was quite important to moving Trump forward.
Well, there's falling in line, and then there's falling in line. I mean, the fact that this conversation is even happening at all illustrates the divisions that are present in the Republican Party right now. It's all some mega version of, I remember in 1988, when Michael Dukakis was the Democratic nominee, I think it was the mayor of New York City, Ed Koch said he'd vote for Dukakis, but he's going to be holding his nose like this while he was doing it. Just the idea that, yeah, I got to stick with my party, but I'm not going to like it. So, contrast this with the fact that there was some question about whether Bernie Sanders would fall in line, and he fell in line big time. He just made it really totally clear. And the fact that someone's saying something like, do I love you? Of course I love you. I love you every day. And I think Paul Ryan is protesting a little bit too much there. And I think it's pretty obvious that that there are some pretty major divisions. It certainly explains the weakness of the Republicans in these deep red states where there are a lot of close races that really shouldn't be close.
And one thing we've talked about is the impact on the House and Senate races and the negative consequences of the leaders like Paul Ryan standing by Trump. If somehow that helps either diminish the majority even more or give the Democrats the majority, I think that decision to passively align with Donald Trump could really be quite important to the strength of the Republicans beyond the White House.
And beyond this year.
and beyond this year for sure, and not just in terms of who controls Congress and the White House, but in terms of legislation. And if this creates a moment where the Republicans not only lose, but set up the conditions for a great society, obviously not a replica, but some burst of legislation that remains with us, I think Republicans are going to be really, really regretting every step that led to this nomination.
Yes.
All right, what's your top pick?
My top pick is something that has not happened yet, and it has to do with something that's going to happen probably after Labor Day, sometime I would say early October, and I'm going to be looking at data to gauge it. It's how people feel about down-ticket races. Polls are starting to come into alignment where Clinton's lead in national polls is roughly paralleling the House generic congressional preference, where about 6% more people prefer a Democratic candidate to a Republican candidate. But as we talked about in the last podcast, about 19% of voters currently report being undecided. And those undecided voters are going to do something. Now, often what they do is they break about evenly, and so it's a net change of no change compared with what happened before they committed. But if they commit even a few percentage points, and if voters shift over towards the Democrats between now and Election Day, that makes a big difference in the outcome. Just to give a sense of it, over at election.princeton.edu, I put a calculation the other day saying that Hillary Clinton is running about 5 percentage points ahead of where Barack Obama was in 2012 when he was running against Mitt Romney in August 2012. So she's 5 points ahead. And if that sticks between now and November, then that means a 10% victory for the presidential candidate this November. We'll see whether it sticks, but that's where it would head. And if these undecided voters on the congressional ballot move in the same direction, then we're talking about something like a 10% margin of victory at the level of congressional races. If that happens at the level of congressional races, if it happens even in state legislative races, this has a pretty significant impact on what happens both at the federal and state level. And so, for example, I would say that if Hillary Clinton is elected president, I would say that it's more likely than not that the Senate will go Democratic, which means that she gets her judicial nominees. But what about the House of Representatives? If a wave materializes, I don't know, that's what I'm waiting for, then what that will lead to is an environment in which the House of Representatives, which basically goes by hard majority rule, it's like Calvin Ball, the rule is that the majority makes the rules. And if that's the case, then that means that the Democrats get to push through their priorities. And that's going to be a very big deal because they're probably going to get about 2 clean years to get minimum wage or infrastructure or climate change or whatever it is that's important to them. Now, at the state legislative level, same story. If down-ticket races move in that direction, state legislatures have been a real point of strength for Republicans the last decade or so. And as we start getting closer to the next wave of redistricting, it's going to be pretty important who's winning races in the next few election cycles. And so I think that there's some shoe that's waiting to drop, and I'm sorry that I can't say exactly when it's going to happen, but I reckon sometime in early October the data will start being pretty clear about that. So that's what I'm looking for as the one remaining future event that I really want to know about, because I think it's going to set the environment for what happens over the next 2 years.
Are there any, I'm putting you on the spot, but are there any particular House races that we should be looking at to get a sense if there's a wave that's going to happen or if this will be politics as usual?
Oh boy, that is a tough question. I would say that there's a few close districts in Minnesota, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd congressional districts. Those are pretty close races. If I recall correctly, I was just reading that actually, surprisingly, there's a real power player in the House of Representatives, Darrell Issa, former car dealer, at one point actually convicted car thief, but never mind that. But anyway, he's been launching investigation after investigation.
Right.
He's a pretty high-profile member of House leadership, and he's locked in a somewhat closer than expected race. And if he has a hard time being reelected, or if he even loses reelection, I think that could be pretty important for as an indicator. So I would say those races. Darrell Issa's race, I forget what district that is. Like I said, a few districts in Minnesota. One could come up with more, but those are just a selection.
Well, my top pick would be Trump's announcement that he's going to run, and not because he announced that he was going to run or that he got into it, but when he said, quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, they're not sending you, they're not sending you, they're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people." And for me, that was, looking back, important because he instantly defined the kind of campaign that he was going to run. And there's many aspects of this Trump candidacy that we can discuss and think about why he's doing well. But one important part is not appealing to economic anxieties. It's really has been appealing to the uglier elements that exist in the American population. And he instantly went after this anti-immigrant sentiment that has been very powerful in parts of the Republican electorate for sure in the past decade. And he did it in the kind of language which revealed right away how he was going to talk about this. And he's done it also with Muslims, and he's done it with race. And I don't know, I think a candidate sometimes can instantly lay his cards or her cards on the table. And this was part of what propelled him. And I think that there was more to doing that than many Republicans realized. It certainly helped mobilize some of his supporters. And at the same time, I think he can't escape that being what he's been about. And now, as he is really stumbling as a campaigner, I think these images and this kind of rhetoric is also hurting him. But he defined his essence right away. And I think in the end, as much as economic anxieties and free trade, or as much as the pizzazz of a television-savvy candidate will be, it's also this element of him. It's the George Wallace part of Donald Trump that really has been the character of this candidacy.
I am interested in that particular point because what it reveals, I think, is the fact that how much of the vote did George Wallace get in 1964?
I don't remember.
It was about 17 to 20%, something like that. Like, a pretty smallish fraction.
As a third-party candidate.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated by the fact that now we have a major party candidate, and the issues of nativism, self-interested foreign policy, and race. I'm super interested in the fact that Trump is very unlikely to go below 40% support, and so that 40% of voters either support those ideas or they're okay with those ideas in their party's candidate. And I am actually quite interested in that, just as a phenomenon illustrating where that political party has gone. And in some sense, it's either who the Republicans are now, or it's something about them that anybody who wants to be a Republican has to face up to. And so that's just a major thing that he stripped bare and revealed for everyone. And I think those factors were there before, and he's at some level a consequence of those factors bubbling along, and he dragged it all right out into the surface and took advantage of it. And I'm very interested in the fact that I think that was the big thing that we learned about the Republican base. And it's a question as to what leaders of either party in the United States are going to do about that sentiment.
Yeah, and I think you're right. If he can pull both the fact Wallace was not a major party nominee, he is, and then if he can pull that percentage of the vote, even a little less, I think it does say a lot about the party. We've talked about, I think both of us agree, Trump is not creating all of this. He is a product of some of the movement that's happened in the Republican Party that we've been talking about with the Tea Party, and we've seen the anti-immigration faction of the GOP is not new. George W. Bush basically couldn't defeat them when he tried to push immigration legislation. I think.
Right, so that's a conflict between the leaders and the rank and file of the party.
But the rank and file are now the leaders, or at least for the time being.
They got the keys. They're in charge.
Well, I hope. We've made it through a list, Sam. I hope the historian bringing you into this leaves you feeling okay. But I think sometimes looking back, certainly as a historian, looking back at these moments, you can learn a lot about them, and you can have a good sense of what a campaign's been about through these kinds of discussions, if they're done well.
Totally agree.
So that wraps up our episode, and please join us again where we're going to continue with this discussion, and thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Take care, everyone.
You've been listening to Politics and Polls, a podcast series about the 2016 presidential election produced by WooCast. The content discussed in this podcast is intended to be informational only. It does not represent nor reflect the views of Princeton University or the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.